Maintenant, nous allons parler
And now
d'un
we're
tout
going to
autre
be talking
sujet.
about a completely different
Nous allons parler
subject,
de la
which
place
is
de la
the
culture et de
role
l'innovation
of
culturelle
culture and
dans
cultural
la
innovation
construction de la ville du
in
futur.
the construction
On parle
of
énormément
cities of the
partout,
future. So
depuis quelques années
this is
maintenant
something
de
we've been
smart
talking
cities, de
about
villes intelligentes,
a lot. So we've been talking
de
a lot
villes du
about
futur, tout
smart
un tas de
cities
concepts
and
qui
cities
méritent
of the
d'ailleurs
future. These are
d'être
concepts
sans doute
which
éclairés, éclaircis et qui le seront par
require
les
some
invités qui sont
explanation
présents.
and some enlightenment.
Nous avons la chance d'avoir
So
parmi
we are
nous, alors
lucky
je
to
vais
have with
laisser
us,
ensuite Jean-Philippe Pierron,
and then I'm going
notre
to hand over to
modérateur du
Jean-Philippe
jour,
Pierron,
les
who is the
présenter
moderator
et
for
les
today,
introduire plus en
to
détail. Je suis
introduce
très
you
heureux
to
en
the
tout cas
different
d'avoir
speakers, but I'm very
avec
happy
nous
to
Henri
have with us
Simons,
Henri Simons
qui est
from
l'ancien échevin
who
à
is
la
the
culture
former
et à l'urbanisme de la ville de Bruxelles. Échevin, ça veut
linchpin
dire
for
adjoint
culture
en belge.
in Belgium.
Nous avons Bruno
At
Bonnell, qui par
Brussels,
ailleurs a
and
une double
also Bruno
fonction. Je laisserai
Bonnell,
Jean-Philippe
who has
le
a dual
présenter, mais qui est
function,
aussi le président
who's
du
also the
conseil
president of the
stratégique du
Strategic
lab. Donc, on a
Council
créé
for
une
the lab.
petite cellule de
So
travail
we've created
extérieure à l'équipe du lab pour pouvoir
a working unit which is
juger,
outside of the lab to judge,
amender,
criticize, and
développer,
amend, and
proposer
develop,
pour
and
l'avenir de ce
make
lab.
proposals for the
Bruno
future of
Bonnell
this
qui a
lab. So Bruno
la lourde charge de
Bonnell
coordonner cette
is
cellule de travail.
coordinating this working unit.
Et puis nous avons la chance et le
And
plaisir
also
et
we
l'honneur d'avoir
have
avec nous Carlos Moreno
the
également,
pleasure to have
que je
Carlos
laisserai,
Moreno with us as
Jean-Philippe
well. So
présenter plus en
Jean-Philippe was
détail.
introduce
Et
you
je
to
passe la
him.
parole à Nadine Gelas,
And
vice-présidente
Nadine
du Grand
Gelas, who is
Lyon,
vice
chargée
president
des
of
industries
Greater
créatives
Lyon,
et des grands
in
événements
charge of
culturels,
creative
qui
industries
va
and
introduire cette
cultural
conférence. Voilà,
events.
je
Is
vous
going to be
remercie. Bonne
introducing this
conférence
conference. So
et
thank you
à
very
tout à l'heure.
much, and I wish you all a very constructive conference, and I'll see you all later on. So, hello everybody. It's a pleasure for me to open this round table, which is devoted to the role of culture in the construction of cities of the future. And this is the title which you can see here on the screen. So I'm going to speak in 10 minutes, so I'm going to be very brief. And I apologize in advance, but the different speakers are going to add to what I said and are going to argue with what I'm going to try and say by way of introduction here very quickly. So to start off with, I'd like to say that culture has one role in the construction of cities of today, but also the cities of yesterday. Some time ago, I can't tell you how long ago this was, it's difficult to actually specify this. Some time ago, culture not only had a function in individual and personal development, but culture was considered to be a structural element, which is a structural part of our cities, and also a territorial challenge. So this is where the concept that you all know comes from, the concept of creative cities. So this is a concept which is widely known, which we talk about in literature. There's a lot of literature and articles on this, and we know that a lot of cities over the years have started talking about this concept. And behind this concept, we have to think about the important role played by culture, not only in terms of town planning, but also urban regeneration, because we know that a lot of cultural facilities were established in industrial wastelands like Bilbao, Metz, and also that a lot of creative districts and creative wastelands became cultural centres. Now, also, behind this concept, we have the role played by culture in creating social links and community living. So this is the meaning given to cultural actions in urban contexts based on social cohesion, where there have been a series of initiatives devoted to culture, which are based on creating links between the population. And so this concept of creative cities also encompasses the role of culture and the link of culture and economic development. So with creative industries, the cultural economy, and here I'm thinking particularly about the flourishing development of festivals and big cultural events which do have this economic role to play, but also I'm thinking about the role played by culture in some cases, and the role given to artists and creative stakeholders in innovation policies. So here I'm thinking about all of the lab-type structures which exist, but we have living labs, fab labs, and career labs, and a whole series of different labs. There are so many labs all over the place, but culture has this virtue, the fact that it enables us to bring together artists and creators, and that includes them in innovation policies. and also the role that culture plays in improving the image of our cities for territorial marketing, for example. And this is something we saw recently in an article published in Le Monde newspaper. So an economist from a school in Paris published this article. I can't remember his name, but he talked about competitiveness, which is also a cultural issue. It plays a role in territorial marketing. So there's no reason why this role, which is attributed to culture, should not continue in the future. And there's no reason why culture should not continue to play a role in the construction of cities of the future. So this famous city of tomorrow that we are talking about in this round table. But as you know, for a few years now, and here again I don't have any precise date to give you, but for a few years now we've witnessed a new phenomenon which we consider to be a revolution. And there have been many revolutions in our history. For example, the revolution in the printing industry, when the printing industry came to the fore. And this revolution that we're now witnessing, and is something we know very well here, the digital revolution with internet, and more particularly with the arrival of all of these new information and communication technologies. So this revolution, and I like this quote a lot by Edgar Morin, means that we have to now rethink everything we do, and we have to restart everything. We have to make a new beginning. So this revolution is really influencing the construction and the functioning of our future cities. And this is where I believe, and this in fact has now replaced the concept of creative cities. This is where the concept of smart cities has come from. And now, as for creative cities, we talk a lot more about smart cities, and there's a great craze for smart cities right now. Just look at what's going on in the rest of the world, but also in France. We're talking more and more about smart cities, and a lot of cities want to be listed and referenced or identified as smart cities. So for France, there's Rennes, Nice, Bordeaux, and a whole series of cities which want to be labelled as smart cities because everybody is hurrying to get the smart city label. So what is behind this concept of smart cities? So here again, I can only be very brief, but I think we're talking about the idea of a city of the future, which is like a city based on technology, which is digitized, which is connected, which is participatory as well, with the objective of providing services to inhabitants so that they can their lives are easier, and so that they can have a more pleasant quality of life. Now, when we observe the programs rolled out by these smart cities, particularly the Greater Lyon Authority programs, which has a program called Lyon Smart Metropolis, I think these programs, above all, are based on energy, transport, mobility, dematerialized public services, open access to data. And if you like, I can give you a presentation of Lyon's program for Smart City. And these are fields which are named to be priority sectors. And in fact, it doesn't at all talk about culture in smart cities. I might be exaggerating this slightly, but there's no reference to culture in the Lyon Smart Cities program. And this appears to be a bit of a danger for the cultural industry, because if we create this technologistic type ideology, and I'd like to recommend a book to you, in fact. This author got carried away in denouncing this new technology revolution, but it's nice to see people who are very enthusiastic about things. Cédric Bergeny, who published a book called The Technological Tyranny, and it's a critique of the digital society. So he's just published another book which is just as fascinating, and which is called The Digital Foothold, or The Digital Stranglehold. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on these books, but he's denouncing this technologistic type ideology which smart cities are based on. And also, he's also using a very strong term, but this is a term used by Michel Foucault as well in his analyses cities, he talks about totalitarian ideology and a functionalistic ideology based on use. So obviously there's a lot to say about this word use or usage, which we talk a lot about when referring to smart cities, and particularly when we're talking about innovation policy. So cities which are founded on usage, on need, and which completely neglect, or more or less neglect, everything to do with symbolism, everything to do with the imagination, everything to do with desires and not needs, and which nonetheless are at the heart of human beings and human beings' lives. So not only do we choose the best technology and try and control our water consumption, but don't forget we have a heart. So I don't want to be too critical of all of this, but I just wanted to point this out, that this is a threat. However, these cities of the future that I've described, these smart cities that I've described, which are supposedly going to be our future, which are highly digitized and participatory, I think these cities should give great importance to culture. So it's up to us to make sure that this is the case, and we have to try and avoid the pitfalls that I talked about earlier on. Now, culture does play a critical role, but culture can also bring about innovation. And here I would like to quote or mention 3 possible ways forward where and talk about the role of culture in our future cities, and say that this role can be based on innovation as well. So first of all, these future cities, or these cities which already exist to some extent, exploit or use an enormous amount of cultural data. So we have to think about how this data is used and how this data is disseminated in all places, in all areas and for all. And let me give you a few examples for our city. So we have an example called Numéridance. So this is a resources center which centralizes all of our dance resources, so dance materials, documents. So we have the dance house here, but we have a collection of materials related to dance and all of this data on dance, and also this enables us to showcase culture in our smart cities, and it provides easy access and more democracy and access to culture. So this is one example. In a smart city, as I have described it very briefly, also there are new cultural fields which might come to the fore. Here, for example, this is one example with current music and digital technology, but I think the technological revolution that our cities are currently undergoing, obviously we have, this affects all sectors of creation with this hybridization between different sectors, experimental culture, well-established culture, and also it breaks down the barriers between what is cultural and what is not cultural, and an explosion in emerging art forms, and also the absence of autonomy of culture, which now is related to anything. So we no longer have any specific field for culture. Culture now pervades everything that we do. And I think this is great from an innovation standpoint. And finally, I think that in our smart cities of the future, we will see the arrival of new cultural practices which are less vertical. So we often distinguish between vertical and horizontal. And this is going to completely change the status of artists and creators and public and private. So we are seeing more and more collaborative practices, network-based practices, shared practices, very decentralized practices. So this will change the relationship between professionals and amateurs, and which can give us more appetite and more creative skill. And we've got some very recent examples. I saw an example just a few days ago where we had an example of a digital book. Which was the fruit of collaboration between the so-called author, because in fact it wasn't one author, it was a collective of authors and readers who constructed certain episodes and certain chapters of this book, which could vary. So I think in future we will see new forms of cultural objects which are very innovative objects. So the smart cities of the future, through these examples I've given you, and here again I'm not exhaustive, so these smart cities can help us encourage the emergence of new forms of culture if we're careful to avoid the pitfalls, and this can breed cultural innovation. So cultural innovation which might enable us to respond to certain questions raised by the cultural field today. So obviously we have the problem of democracy and access to culture, the problem of the status of artists, and the problem of the emergence of new forms of culture. And also this cultural innovation which will appear in our smart cities will also require innovation in public policies and their approach to culture. So a few examples how to build cultural facilities. What type of cultural facilities should we build? Should we even build any cultural facilities in the future, or should everything be virtual? How do we consider public spaces in relation to culture? How we consider artistic objects? In any event, we could talk about this a lot more later on, but we need innovation in public policies, and I'll conclude on this point. As Jérôme de Lormas said, we need, through this cultural innovation in our smart cities of the future, we need another approach to the human beings and another approach to community living and otherness and our approach to others, and we have to tap into our creative potential so as to create pleasure on a large scale. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadine Gelas. So now I'm going to introduce very quickly the three speakers, and I would like to apologize for Pierron, who unfortunately was not able to join us this afternoon. So let me present the three speakers in order. So the idea is, following on from what Nadine Gelas has just said, is to think about these smart cities, and what's interesting in what she's just said is how this expression smart cities is very attractive, but also how ambiguous it is. And in relation to what she's just said, the idea is to how policies are going to include these ideas in this new project. So we have three speakers. The first person who's going to speak is Henry Simons, who is on my right here, who's director of the Atomium in Brussels, and he is administrator or director of a certain amount of cultural facilities, and we wanted you to start this discussion this evening. And at the end of the day, if we're thinking about innovation, urban innovation, and construction of our cities of the future, there are certain challenges, political challenges, as Nadine Gelas has just said. And a city requires tools, buildings, and a city is also founded on sharing and shared spaces, policies. And I think this is what you're going to be talking about, Henry Simons. And it was said earlier on that you are a former mayor, alderman in Brussels, and you were in charge of culture and town planning issues. Now, the second person who's going to be speaking is Carlos Moreno, who is a professor. So professor, university professor, and you are working on the convergence of scientific disciplines and all forms of creativity, so the mix between political creativity, social creativity, and technical creativity. But at the same time as being a professor, which gives you your point of view from a conceptual standpoint, you also work for GDF SUEZ, and this is a French group, but also you're a citizen of the world. And in preparing this round table, you were saying that you are not a thinker on the fringe, but a thinker of the fringes. So you like to think from the fringes, and you like to think about these intermediate spaces and these oscillating spaces, which is where cities of the future come from, in your opinion. And then our last speaker is Bruno Bonnell, who is a multiple entrepreneur, if we can call him that, and he has done a lot of work in digital industries. And just to remind you, you created the company called Infograms, which then became Atari, and also Infony, which is access to the internet, and also Digito, and you wrote a book called Robopolis, and at the same time you were president of EM Business School, and you have done a lot of work with the labs. So the idea is to talk about the political challenges and how we move from political challenges to operational challenges and vice versa. And we have about 20 minutes at the end of your presentations for a short discussion. So I'm here to keep the time, but I'd like to make a few observations to start off with before we hand over to my neighbour, and I'd like to talk about the role of culture in the construction of cities of the future, and talk about this idea of culture in general, and this comes back to the book written by Anna Arendt, which is the cultural crisis between past and future. So obviously the translation does not reflect the original title. So it's a question of this link between the past and the future, which is at the heart of cultural dynamics, because at the end of the day, when we think about culture, we always tend to either focus on the past dimension of culture and how we're going to protect culture. And the risk is that we forget what we might call ancestral pathos, which is a culture based on only museums, and it's like a monumental approach to culture. So we have this tension between past and future, and we tend to concentrate too much on the past and how to protect culture from the past, but we know that it's important to focus on the future. Okay, we do have our memory, but also we have to focus on innovation and another form of pathos, which is that of what's new, what's novel. And here again, don't forget, there's perpetual change and perpetual movement, which is supported by technological innovation. So this approach to culture is interesting, because when Arendt talks about culture as being a breach, where between past and future we emerge, well, we give way to the future, and I think this is something we're going to be talking about with Mr. Moreno later on. But this brings me on to a second observation, which is this ambiguity related to the word innovation. So in the history of the Western world, this history is supported by the idea of progress, social progress, political progress, also the general discourse on emancipation. But in fact, progress now has reached crisis point, whereas in the past, in fact, this idea of progress has been supported by technological systems. And at the end of the day, the question is whether this old model and the thinkers of the Enlightenment who talked about this, whether we can make progress without technological foundations. So innovation is the technological world we give to a resource which is used to serve an ideal, which is that of progress. And now I think at the end of the day, we are living in a world which is marked by technological innovation, but the problem is we no longer have any objectives for the future. So how are we going to relate progress to innovation now? And I think when thinking about how we construct our cities of the future, we have to take this into account, because innovation for the sake of innovation, and this is what I heard previously, will not be fruitful for our common good, or our human world, because our human world is not only based on technology. We need technology, but we need to share desires as well, and we need to share hope for the future. But also our cities, our spaces, where we have this tension between the past and the future, and our cities are a concentration of space and time and temporality. So we have the long time or the long temporality, which is the buildings that very often have been there for hundreds of years. But we have to think about the future as well of our cities. And there's a universal experience that all cities encompass, which is the experience of their past history through those who have lived, those who live in a city. And we have to live in a city with people who we necessarily haven't chosen to live with, but this means that our city policies have to give consistency to how we live in our cities, but also there's a political aspect to this, which is how we plan our cities, because living in the city is a fundamental experience, and the policies define some kind of orientation. But then we have something which is between the two, which is how we urbanize our cities, and this obviously is reflected in the buildings we build, the architecture of our cities, and the different technological systems which are provided by the cities, and obviously this includes computerization of our cities. So now I'm going to hand over to Mr. Simons to talk about this possible tension between our urban spaces and city policies.
Merci. Intervenir après le philosophe.
Well, speaking after a philosopher is not an easy task. So I'm a former deputy mayor for culture, and I also did town planning in Brussels. So those two actually fit together quite well. In fact, on the question of the city, not just the physical aspect of the city, but also its artistic life as well. So I was very lucky to have those roles. And I think there's, it's also a very interesting way to think about the content, the life of a city. You can do this with cultural projects, but have to have a certain strategy to do this. So I've been, I was thinking about some of the different measures. There's policy involved. Of course, there's a certain ideology even, and, we may have different views on different ideologies, but I think you have to have, a real commitment to a certain type of content. I myself am a town planner, And David Mangin's work said that a durable city, a sustainable city, is one that can adapt to new conditions, be they economic, social, or environmental. And so a sustainable city is not for him just a history. A city must change with the new realities of its time. And so this, I think shows a certain opposition between, heritage and movement. So a sustainable city must provide services such as schools, retail, culture, and this should be all possible without taking one's car. And the notion of public space is open and free of access, and yet this is challenged. When you see in some towns districts that are only for the rich, and some residents are almost sequestered in their poor neighborhoods. So it's a segregation is taking place. If you look at Brussels and French cities, for us in Brussels, it's the rich are in the center and the poor are, the poor are in the center, the rich are on the outside. It tends to be the reverse in France. So the notion for public space, to me, has its standard definition, of course, a certain territory. You're going to do a new street, create a park, a new public square, revitalize a district. But you have to do it for a reason. And you do this to create new spaces, as like Albert Mas has said. You develop a physical place to do something on that physical space or public square. This can be a marketplace. It can be a place for cultural exhibits. A cultural center. So you don't do it just for it to be pretty. You want to do it because it's going to create life and movement. So the public space is dual, in fact. And this is what really motivated me for my urban redevelopment projects, and also my commitment to supporting artistic cultural initiatives. So, sometimes you have to give guidance as well. You have to help new ideas emerge, help associations of artists and creative projects, but you can't do everything, obviously. So we put together a certain number of projects, which I can talk to you about, and let me tell you a bit. So for me, the public space is a state of mind as well. How can we preserve the spirit of our cities without dwelling too much on its functionalities? It's not just, practical functionalities that are at the heart here. How can we make the public the actors of city life as well? So understanding the ways, in which society can function without being structured by the state, what role can new technologies play? Some smart, the smart city. A city isn't we've talked about the smart cities. I want a city to be a living place. I don't know if it's a smart place, but it has to be accessible to all, where people are comfortable moving around physically and mentally, spiritually. So this is, we can never obtain perfection in this area, but it should nonetheless be our ambition. So our public policy has to help encourage this, encourage diversity, and bring people together so that we move away from this segregation of the rich and poor districts. So there has to be a dual methodology. First of all, we have to counter the traditional methodologies so that there's a more participative process and not just a top-down process. So this means listening, paying attention, keeping your eyes open at all times to emerging projects. And the city has to be ready and willing to support new ideas. And it has to start, it has to be more of a bottom-up process, keeping your ear to the ground, following, the new ideas that are emerging there. It can't be top-down for it to be more democratic. And it has to be a political, so we have to facilitate the circulation of people and ideas. And it's up to the public authorities to ensure, at the political level and economic level, that this freedom of movement and freedom of ideas is possible, and it's a battle. Sometimes there are conflicts of interest, and this is what the political leaders must support to create a balance, because there is a horrible imbalance in many of our cities. And so in an urban culture, must be a space for emancipation, of freedom. And that's a crazy dream. It's a wild dream, perhaps you'll tell me. But we want a maximum number of people to be able to have access to all the possibilities of the city, and in particular to its cultural opportunities. I like to quote Jacques Rancière. He talks of a process of equality, and it's a play of practices. You must presume the equality of all, and then ensure that it is a genuine equality. So I think that's a good guideline, a good for our policies to build, to construct the city that we want to develop. And there are some key focal areas here. So, for example, foster decentralization so that there's more participation from civil society, convert public spaces, moving away from the closed cultural space to create an open cultural space, taking in new spaces, streets, abandoned buildings, things like that, and move around, change things from one year to another. Also giving space to new forms of expression, particularly targeting the new generations are particularly open to these new forms of expression. And so the smart technological city can also help make this happen, but on the condition that they are supported as a tool. There shouldn't be this myth of progress. That I reject, this idea of, it's not because it's technologically new that it's wonderful, fantastic, and the solution to all. No. It always has to be serving man. It has to be serving the populations of our cities. So we want to break down the walls between our different artistic domains as well, to create a better interconnection and open up the horizons of these institutions as well, making them more accessible to all. A coherent policy for quality cultural events as well, and really, and also being at the forefront of new developments as well, and not simply repeating the old traditional cultural forms that we know of. It's the city authorities' role as well to promote new forms. This can be defined in different ways. But it demands a real political commitment. And so we need to develop some concrete programs and take over new sites. So perhaps you don't all know Brussels, but our city center was very poor, but has been redeveloped. But between the Gare du Midi, where you arrive from the south, or the Gare du Nord, if you want to go further north, and in 1952 there was, these train stations were developed, and the connection between the two developed, but it created something of a barrier in the city along the line of the railway tracks. It cuts the city. And so what we've tried to do is to give a new life to that whole area. So to take over the train stations, first of all, for cultural events on occasion, and to bring together artists, the population, the authorities, economists, philosophers, and engage them all in new types of artistic projects. That's just one example of what we've done. But the exhibition is currently open, so I'm doing a bit of advertising for that. I hope you'll find time to go to Brussels to see us. It's called Junction. So here you can see the center where the railway line goes through and really creates a barrier on the left, for the two sides of the city. At the Fine Arts Museum, so we wanted to make this a very special site, and we asked 4 architectural firms to create large-size tapestries around this theme. And so here you can see just a bit of an idea of it's open to the public, free of charge. And this was a way to start talking about the city. Perhaps it was a bit too intellectual for starters, but we then created different events and activities around this. Here you see the central station, hundreds of thousands of people come through the station, but we put in artistic installations and performances to get people to take a different look or experience the train station in a different way. So here you have some of the artists and designers who participated. So moving into this space, a train station is, not an easy place to work. And we also took over a building which had been abandoned since 1958, in fact, so a very long time. And it's a huge space. Look at those columns. It's extraordinary. It was for the bus station for the World Expo, which was in Brussels. And then after that, it wasn't ever used again. And so the people at Brussels haven't seen it for 40 years. So it's very interesting to take back this space. So here you see one of the projects, and then we will use it for a certain time, and then I believe there's going to be a redevelopment there. But for now, we're using it for our purposes, for our exhibits. Also, we took over another space. Here, we tried to create something new here, and it completely transformed the space here. And so here, what the artist is trying to say is we're not talking about what is art and what is beautiful. So he wants people to stop and think about that. And people stop and look at it and wonder about it. And it makes people look at the space differently, think about the different possibilities for this space. And it's thanks to an artist's touch here. So that we were able to launch a discussion around this. Here we have another artist. They're wondering, why is there a rail laid down on this public square? And it was a bit of an event as well, you can see, and it stirred up a lot of debate. Here we have a tapestry which was laid into a train car. So on a line between starting from Affligen. And so it's a focus on the Silk Road because this line comes through areas where there's high immigration. As you know, we have difficulties with this issue in Belgium, the issues of immigration. So that was one way to address that issue artistically. We're also working, as I said, in the train stations, doing some bas-relief sculptures.
Voilà. Et donc, d'autres œuvres comme celle-ci.
Here are some other works, the train, the infinite train rail.
Ce que nous avons voulu faire par là,
what we're trying to do with all this was work with artists to really reach out to a public just passing by. You know, not everyone goes to museums. So making this art accessible, visible, getting people coming back to places where they no longer go, and giving life, revitalizing sites all over the city thanks to this artistic work. And here, it's a huge maze in the Gare du Nord, the northern city, and people were very surprised to see this work on the floor, and they would skirt around it, whereas actually they could walk on it. So it was kind of funny to watch people's reaction to this artistic work. So that's the kind of thing we've been working on in recent times. Thank you.
Vous avez commencé par dire qu'il n'y avait pas de politique sans idéologie, mais il y a...
Well, you're saying that there's no policy without ideology, but it seems like there's no ideology without a certain utopian vision either. So the imagination and creativity, it doesn't separate us from reality, but in your case can really awaken us to our surroundings and to reality. Thank you, Jean-Philippe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to thank the European Lab for inviting me as well. So I'm now very happy that I took that 10-hour flight to be with you here. And I will be, I've been listening with great interest to what you've been saying about, the smart city or the city of the future. And we've been hearing about, this coming together of different disciplines. And these creative instances, when we can reach out to new audiences. And some of the very, and you made a very concrete demonstration there of what you have been able to do. So I'm advisor to the president of COFELY INEO, which belongs to GDF SUEZ Corporation. I'm scientific advisor to the president. And I particularly focus on the project of the Smart City. And so we focus on these questions. Well, we heard Bruno talk about artificial intelligence and what it can contribute. But I'm particularly interested in the mix and the hybridization of different fields. And and I'm also focusing on the sustainable digital city in particular. But I think I'm part of a school of thought which, we're not philosophers in any sense of the word, of course, but we want to try to develop certain concepts, but give them a concrete illustration.
C'est pas un mail, c'est juste un petit guideline que je me suis donné pour bien tenir le temps.
So, As I was saying,
moi je préfère parler de plutôt qu'une ville intelligente, je me reconnais pas trop dans le fait que la ville.
So this whole concept of the smart city, you know, I think it's been a marketing gadget at times, and I hear this in some conferences, you know, and on my blog you can read some of the things that I've seen about this.
Dans l'avant-garde d'un concept qu'on appelle donc le smart citizen.
So and then we talk about the smart citizens. So what is this? So, you know, it really has to be, you know, it has to be people at the center of this movement, you know, to meet basic needs as well. You know, but, you know, there's more than just the basic needs. There are, you know, a need for freedom, a need for fulfillment and achievement. So people need that. People expect and want and need progress. So when you look at those needs, it's not just necessities, it's broader than that. And I think that's what drives people, and that's part of our daily lives. And so and so we have to, our work a bit is to develop a certain number of concepts to make urban life more meaningful to our citizens. I was in Colombia just a few days ago, you know, but I was read about you know, flooding. We're very connected. We live in a very connected world these days, and people expect that, people need that, because, and so the smart city is also a place where people must be able to express themselves and be creative as well. There's also a school of thought that as I often say on my conferences on the life sciences, organizing a conference in Paris, and we have debates on the question of the city of tomorrow. Already means building the city of today, and it can't just be a technocratic construction. And we can't reduce the smart city to a question of digital infrastructure. You know, that's not what it's all about, you know, and there's this, it seems to be, you know, fashionable. It's the buzzword of the day, but we have to think harder about what we mean. You know, if we want to build the city of the future, we have to build it today. Well, what do we mean by that? You know, and you're not going to sit around and wait for philosophers to tell you how that should work. And, you know, we need to look around us, you know, be it Asia, the Occident, or whatever. So this is part of the intellectual process, you know, a task I try to put myself through. And to be more human-oriented and not so technically oriented, that's important to me. And I think it demands that we be very attentive, you know, beyond a certain. When we say we want to be a people-centered city, we can see there are three elements. You know, there's beliefs, desires, and intentions which animate people. And they express themselves very differently depending on the historical, cultural, political context. And if you know, in Europe, they're certainly not the same as what you're going to find in Tibet, or Bogota, or Beijing. So, you know, it's very diverse. And so meeting all of those expectations needs can be a complicated task in some cases. So we have to have the empathy which is necessary to understand others. and then look at what is possible in terms of hybridization or mixity. If in a technocentric vision of the world, you're only focusing on the what technology is capable of doing. But if it doesn't meet people's beliefs, intentions, or desires, well, then what use is it? And does it meet people's needs? In France, for example, I participate in a group discussing usages and functions of these various technologies. For example, the car, it's a function of mobility. It's not about cars, it's about mobility. So that's what I'm trying to describe here. And what we call intermodality or connectivity is, making use of all of the different forms of mobility. And so, be you in Lyon, Paris, or Nice, this is part of the day-to-day reality of our citizens. In Rio 3 weeks ago, part of the population has very difficult problems with mobility in Brazil. And yet it's the fifth power in the world and has been fighting very hard against illiteracy, has been making great strides in this area to get kids to go to school, to make sure that mothers, parents ensure that their children, do their homework. There's a build-up of the middle class, and they have more purchasing power now. In terms of GDP, Brazil is number 5. And so if you tell the people in Rio, when you tell them what we're doing with the electric vehicles, well, for the middle class in Brazil, who have just emerged from poverty, for them, even just having a car was a way of becoming a full member of society. So, owning a car, just the fact of owning a car, is an expression, a form of the success. So we have to understand this. We have to understand their understanding of mobility in the car. For them, it's a question of a social status. When I was in, and you can also see this in other developments in Rio. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a different context from one country. In the West, here, out of 7 billion people on the planet, there's almost as many different types of electronic connection. 2030 will be 8 billion people on Earth, and there will be 20 billion connected devices. So this is thanks to the digital developments. And so this is an absolutely extraordinary ratio here. So, but there's, and so we're seeing all types of different devices be developed, and so the telephone has become much more than a telephone, the cell phone or mobile phone. And it's gone far beyond the act of phoning. And our phones now take photos, of course. So these devices have broken down barriers of their usage. So we have this way of being able to connect ourselves, and it's something, it's considered almost an acquired right, if you will. People demand to be able to be connected. And so this digital link or ties to others, but that's just not enough.
Je parle de ce que je considère être un trait d'union dans les différentes cultures. Que j'appelle les digizen. Les digizen, c'est les
I like the word digizen, the digital citizen, the citizen who is permanently, continually connected, and it's a kind of social tie that is created in a very particular way. So technical innovation is really just an instrument. The real innovation is social innovation. So the digizen, the digital citizen, it's creating a new social ties, a connection to others, so a social tie, which has taken a very different form. But, we don't want to become zombie geeks. On the other hand, this intensive consumption but there's not necessarily any real contribution to mankind or society. So for social urban innovation, this can be a very powerful way of integrating people. I was the other week with architects in Colombia working on various town planning issues, particularly housing, and building houses using bamboo and earth and a lot of recycled materials to build houses, and which are about the 10th of the cost of others. And what was interesting here is what they did was via the social networks, they were able to attract some very, leading experts from Germany to come in and participate in the projects. That's a social tie. In the favelas, if you can teach people to build this type of house with the know-how of an expert with materials available to them, well, here we have created something important. It's the digizen has come into play here, and we're creating value in that way. In Kathmandu, you've got the mountains of the Himalaya nearby. They have problems with water, access to water there. So, can technology bring them water? So, they need water. That is their primary need. The water is there, but the distribution networks are not. So here we have to work with innovators in technology, but also innovative in other ways, to think about ways to use water that are different usage of water. So what is their main form of communication? It's the radio.
So, what I say, and this is one of the main reasons why I gave this presentation, I say that a city is a living entity, and a city is a complex system, which I consider to be a living organism and a human organism. So a city is born, it grows up, and it develops, and it's subject to unforeseen circumstances. So it's difficult to manage in general. It's not highly centralized. So we have to create a density, and we have to increase the density of the city. We have to create density in usages and services. And let me finish with these words, which I'm very attached to, which I call hybridization through platforms. So hybridization and the ability to be able to take the best of the technology which exists and also increase its power, increase its density, but also to cross-fertilize this with social needs resistance or resilience, and also the ability to live better and the ability to ensure community living, mixity and otherness. And the digital era is a real opportunity for us, and I think we should take advantage of this opportunity. We're lucky enough to be living in this 21st century and to be witnessing the explosion of these ubiquitous technologies. And this technology is at the reach of everyone. Every smartphone you have today has enormous computing power, calculation power, which enabled NASA to send people to the moon in 1969. The simplest smartphone has this technology now. So hybridization, living entity, and mixity, empathy. These are the key words.
La vice-présidente, Madame Gelas, en fait,
the Vice President, Nadine Gelas, works on fashion and fabric, and we have to think about how we weave together our urban spaces and how to create these networks. So this is another way of thinking about fabric. And this brings us on to Bruno Bonnell, who I'd like to hand over to without further ado. Yes, thank you very much. I have tried to take another approach to this debate, and I thought about whether the question we've raised had a positive or negative answer. So, does culture play a role in the construction of cities? So, let me start with that question. And I thought that let me take this question from the other way around and said, well, what will happen in a city if we take culture away from it? So, I'm not going to talk about Alexandria and the ransacking of Alexandria with the barbarians. So we saw that if we destroyed the cultural intelligence in a city, even if it was very powerful, in history you can see that the city immediately declines. In Alexandria this was the case, in Rome or in other cities this was always the case. But more recently, when you look at a city such as Denver, not Denver, sorry, the city of the car city, Detroit. I was thinking about dinosaurs in Denver, so I saw a film on dinosaurs yesterday, so that's why I was thinking about Denver. So Detroit, which was based on cultural innovation, which was the advent of the car, which created these technologies, but this became the automotive culture in the city. When the automotive culture collapsed in Detroit, rap was still left, but the city collapsed as well. So I think this shows that despite or irrespective of the type of culture that you're dealing with, and irrespective of the culture you envisage, whether it's academic, traditional, or completely technology-based, we realize that culture gives meaning to the urban structure in which we live. And if you get rid of this cultural aspect, this destroys this urban culture, because man, by definition, is an anthropic animal, but an expensive animal, and men group together around tribes or in tribes. And obviously, these tribes are based on need, but also these tribes are based on exchange and dialogue. And I think the role of culture is this. We do have to ask this question, but I think that culture should be at the heart of everything we do. And I think economic aspects are very often hidden or masked, the expansion of our cities, and saying, okay, we have to develop, so we have to develop our cities from an economic angle, and we've focused only on the economics, and we've completely neglected the cultural aspects. Now, the second comment I'd like to make is what has happened, and why are we asking this question today? So at the end of the day, why don't we just leave it up to nature and let nature take its course, as we have done for decades or hundreds or thousands of years? Because at the end of the day, cities are relatively autonomous social bodies which develop alone. Okay, we do have town plans and blueprints, but the cities tend to develop without us. But when you look at what happened at the end of the 19th century right through to today, you've seen that there have been some technological breakthroughs which have developed different cultures and which have required us to transform our cities physically. So let me try and explain my thinking. If you take the end of the 19th century, for example, and right up to the end of the First World War, we opened our cities up, and Haussmann, for example, in Paris, opened up the cities and restructured the city and the city blueprint, because we wanted to overhaul or give those cities a facelift. left. But unfortunately for a lot of people, as wars killed off half of the people who lived in our cities, there was a renewal, new waves of immigration, for example, in France, in the big urban centres. And therefore, we had to attract new generations into these cities to regenerate our cities. So therefore, city cultures were changed. So we opened up these big thoroughfares to give room to more modern transport systems. But at the same time, we opened up new cultural centres and operas and theatres and cinema halls, which changed the face of our cities. Now, I created a software program called SimCity, which has been released in several editions. So this is a form of modelling a city, and which is supposed to make people happy to live in their cities. Now, the first release of this software program, which was released somewhere about 20 years ago, we built cinemas, and we had the satisfaction rate for the people living around the cinemas we built, which were enabled us to gain a lot of points. But if we forgot to build roads and to change the geography and to build car parks, people would start complaining because there would be traffic jams, and therefore we'd lose points in SimCity. So when building cultural facilities, you haven't to forget all the services that go with those. But if we take this even further, and if we look at what happened after the Second World War, here again, this is right at the heart of our cities, because there were a lot of civilians and physical structures in our cities which were destroyed in our Second World War. Here we saw the arrival of electronics and other forms of telecommunications and communications, which made us think about our cities differently, and which once again changed the geography of our cities. So if I'm saying this, it's because over the centuries we've seen some very interesting changes. We've seen the destruction of certain forms of culture in our cities. A lot of these cultures, and these cultures were victims to these wars, and this has given way to the emergence of audacious and new forms of culture. Now, since the end of the Second World War, and I hope this will continue for a few centuries, now in Europe we've been living on, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say that I've confined my thinking to Europe. I could say a lot about other megalopolises across the world, but I've limited my thinking to Europe. So what's happened is now we have two worlds which cohabit, and two fundamental cultures which haven't disappeared. Now, there's a symbolic date which is 1980, because I wanted to have some kind of reference here. So this is a flag date which was 50 years ago. So before 1980, we didn't really have any IT which had been developed. The digital world didn't really exist. And so we were still living in a tradition of learning and culture based on what we might call an analogical world. And then from 1980 onwards, we saw the development of new culture, which was the digital culture in all shapes and sizes. And Lyon Sonore is a perfect example of this. So we had the computer in 81 and digital telecommunications with mobile phones in the 1990s, internet in the noughties, and smartphones and big data and smart, once again, this word which is coming back again. And then robotics as of the year 2020. Objects are begun to become increasingly intelligent and connected as of 2020. And our environment has changed to form and has become smarter from a decision-making standpoint. And I'd like to talk about artificial emotion and artificial intelligence, which is another debate. Anyway, so now we're in the presence of populations who have cultural roots which are analogical, who are still alive. So this is over 50, people over the age of 50, who for the most part are in good health, because obviously people are aging longer and longer. So these people, I hope, will be around for a long time. I'm part of these people over the age of 50, so let's smile because we're all well. And then you have another generation, which is what I call the native digital generation. And they say, hey, we don't have the same codes, we don't have the same way of living as you do. And one very simple example is anecdotal. For example, if you need to see someone, I will take my car, I'll take the metro, and I'll physically move to go and see that person. But this is still a very human approach to people. But other people will take a phone and they will Skype with that person. So, for example, I've got a daughter who lives in Canada, and I get the impression that I see her every day, but she lives in Canada because I Skype her. So every 2 days we're on Skype together. And this complementarity of information, which is given by sound plus image, which was something which is in the realms of science fiction in the 1980s with the 2001 Space Odyssey, with this big screen where you had an astronaut talking to his daughter on a TV screen. That was seen to be brilliant at the time, but now this is very commonplace. And this cohabitation of different generations is something which is real now, and this is what causes a lot of conflict around when talking about the world culture. And this conflict is becoming increasingly apparent. And in fact, there are two sides: people who want us to transform our cities quicker and quicker and make our cities increasingly digital, and then you have the other side who says this is good, but we're not used to this, it's going too quick for us, and we don't know what's happened. So I don't agree with this myself. I don't think we can boil down technology to just simple tools. In fact, technology is at the heart of culture, and technology is at the heart of transformation of our cities. Technology is not just a series of pipes which hold content. Technology is much more than just pipes or connections. So this notion of digital that you've just talked about is fundamental. So these digigens now are going to be inhabiting our cities. So the third idea I have, and then I'll conclude, is that when we talk about cities, we very often talk about infrastructures. And so we have different time frames in cities, long time frames, for example. When we talk about these digigens, we talk about instantaneousness. And so there's a difference between the time frames of cities and citizens. So we have various time frames that we live in. So this is where ubiquity comes from. So we can communicate differently, and we can travel differently now, and we're more ubiquitous. But this is not enough now. So now we've solved a lot of technology issues. So we had in the past what we called these villages, which then became cities, and these cities increasingly are becoming metropolises or megalopolises, since they're so big, and with all the difficulties that this creates for living in these metropolises and megalopolises. And it's difficult to manage things. If you live in the Korean quarter of New York, you're in the Korean quarter. And if you walk through the Korean quarter of New York, you see it's got a New York-based infrastructure with these streets which are highly planned and built up and very standard streets and follow the norms for the construction in New York. But if you go into the Korean quarter, then 3 streets down you have the Jewish quarter, which is completely different again. So this is what we call New York is a world city. So New York is a pile-up of different cultures, and this is why we have these different cultures which have come and settled in the city. And if we let those different cultures develop without trying to control them, you'd see in the Korean area of the city they'd build buildings which are completely different to the other areas of the city, because New York was built based on American philosophy. So you still have to give room for cars to drive for Americans. Now, if we got rid of cars parked on the streets, don't forget that 95% of the time when you own a car, this car is parked and not moving, and this car is parked in the street. So imagine a city like Lyon, Paris, New York. Imagine the number of square meters occupied by parked cars, and imagine how much space this takes up. Now, if in future we got rid of these parked cars, then we'd get more space, and naturally the culture would change. So as soon as in Lyon every summer, and congratulations to Lyon for doing this, as soon as we start building terraces and replacing car parks with terraces, what happens? People start drinking the aperitif or the Beaujolais wine, and we have a new form of culture, a new culture which comes to the fore, a new form of exchange. And some restaurants build terraces to attract customers or install strange objects on their terraces. For example, one restaurant will put a rugby ball there on the terrace because they want to attract rugby players or rugby fans. So basically what I'm saying is that this notion of cities is based on its culture. So I still have a minute left, and I'm going to try and sum up very quickly. So what I'm trying to say is that this split between city time and human time, well, cities have to take account of the fact that these famous digitons see two types of cities, two cities which are actually linked by something which is a new form of culture, which is interactive culture. And these citizens I will qualify as augmented citizens. So I think when constructing the city of the future, which we've called the smart city, okay, there are a lot of definitions of smart cities, but these augmented citizens will see that part of their life is physical, and obviously they have to have living spaces, living areas, but we have to optimize these areas thanks to all of these super technological interactive systems, but we don't necessarily always maximize their happiness in doing this, because, okay, we can optimize car traffic flow, we can optimize electricity distribution, and maximizing the happiness of living in a city, which I think is one of the main objectives, so as to conserve our well-being. This means we have to work on culture, and this is why I think when thinking about the role of culture in cities, I think cities have to open up to this digital world, but they have to become leaders, not physical leaders, by saying I'm going to build a new opera or a new theatre, or I'm going to work in disused buildings, for example. But we have to give cities an extra dimension, and we have to give every citizen living in our city the right to access digital culture, and there has to be a minimum digital communication service provided by our cities. And the first city that says all of my cities, all of my citizens, or all of my inhabitants are entitled to minimum digital service. I think this is critical now, and this means that we have to give them digital tools as well, because everybody has a smartphone. That's what we say, but in fact this is far from being true. Not everybody has a smartphone today, but if we all have the right tools, then we'll be able to live in our cities very differently. So this will change the way we use our cities. And we should understand that this will be an essential tool for living in our cities, but also for creating culture in our cities, because beyond the notion of paying with smartphones, beyond the notion of access to information on what's going on where, so these smartphones will enable us to bring people together, to assemble people in gatherings, and enable people to discover new cultural initiatives and to exchange cultural initiatives. So I think culture will play an extremely strong role, but we have to take account of the needs of these famous digitons, and we have to make sure that cultural investments in our cities are also invested in this digital world. So this is my idea on this issue, and I think that we don't just have to think about cities as places where people live and are hosted. In fact, I think we have to move on to a new phase, and this will be my conclusion, that these megalopolises that we can manage with these digital tools will move from what we call to urban matrices, to places where not only will we have places to live, which nourishes us physically or feeds us because we work there or live there, but will nourish us intellectually as well, so that we can reconcile all of these different cultures with something from beyond, which is this awareness that a city is a melting pot of all of these different cultures. So I don't want to be too like Nietzsche here, but I think that cities can only develop if they have this strong cultural links which go beyond its physical structure, and this, I think, resides in the digital world. And I won't explain the transition from the analogical world to the digital world, but that will be for another debate.
Donc on a une petite dizaine de minutes comment dire, pour la discussion avec vous, donc si vous le souhaitez. Donc allons-y. Oui. Alors je ne sais pas comment... Oui. Il y a un... Vous pouvez vous présenter simplement une question courte en même temps. Hein. Merci.
Monsieur Bonnell, la technologie a...
So,
yes,
Mr. Bonnell, you know, the city without cars, that would be fantastic. Well, why aren't you working on that more actively? What can't we, Mr. Colon, who seems to like skyscrapers, who's your question for exactly, sorry? All of you, actually, you know. Well, it's perhaps not at the, you know, I think there are a lot of people working on this subject, but, you know, it takes time to come up for a response, for a solution to that. And, you know, there are a lot of articles on the city that the Digizen, you know, will hopefully be able to do without the car. And that's part of the, you know, that takes a certain ambition. You know, when I gave a conference recently, you know, can you imagine your life without a car right now as a city dweller? You know, and and people just originally thought, you know, all of them thought that would simply be impossible. And then after, you know, a certain time, you know, after discussing with them and explaining them things to them, half of them changed their mind. So and yet the car is the second item cost up to 2011, but it has fallen from that. It's now telecommunications have replaced a lot of the need, and so the cars come down to the third budget item for households in urban centers. Well, an attempt at a short response, and many cars simply don't move around in the city. They're parked, so a lot of people are not taking their cars, and you might need it for, you know, a certain reason. I don't think we need to feel overly guilty about having a car. However, parking the cars means that they're in places where we don't want them. In cities like Tokyo with 23 million people, you can't park in Tokyo, so people don't use the car. And so, you know, you are not taking up so much public space, but you have to have a very high-performance public transport system. Any other questions? Well, I'd like to add something. In Abidjan, for example, they have shared taxis. You know, and so people that really don't walk much, you know, you raise your hand, a taxi's there, and it's easy to get around Abidjan. So there's, you know, many possible solutions. Well, there's a certain inertia, it's true. Any other questions? Comments?
Bonjour,
Romain Garcia from the Teacher Training School. There's a concept that I think cuts across the different talks we've heard, and this is the notion of obsolescence. There's laws, for example, against programmed obsolescence. But some of these technologies you've talked about, you know, isn't there also a risk of rather rapid obsolescence in some of the, and Mr. Simmons was talking about the train stations becoming obsolete, technologies that became obsolete much more quickly than we expected. So how do we deal with that risk of
obsolescence. You know, cities don't become obsolete, or at least hope not to. So what's the secret there? Well, yes, it's true that technology moves very, very quickly, and this means obsolescence comes quickly as well. So this is why I am not such a huge fan. You know, technology is very interesting, very useful, but I don't think that that is the key of the smart city. It's a shared knowledge, and we can have the tools to achieve that. And, you know, and I certainly have fun with my smartphone, but that's not the key to everything. Thank you for your question. That's very interesting. And that brings me back to something, obviously, in 10 minutes we can't talk about. There's a concept that I really believe in, and which we hear talked about sustainable systems. There's the question of the sustainable city. And you're talking about obsolescence, but you can look at it another way. When you talk about a frugal city is where you can do a lot more with much less. But what that much less means using what exists and then recontextualize what exists. So you have this whole panoply of technologies available to you. And they they change every 3 years. We don't even use 10% of the capacity of some of these devices. So whereas frugality really speaks to us to cultural and social practices. Frugality means we can take things which might seem obsolete, use them in a different context, and continue to use them. And this you will find in places in a very different scale, reusing computers, which we consider obsolete, but which others might find still very useful. If you just have to do some basic accounting or something for an association, this computer can still be very useful to someone. And they're all technical devices and objects can have this second and third life. And so the frugal society, we have to reconsider the usage of these documents, these devices, And so there's an interesting movement, the self-repairing, where people come together. I will bring in an object which doesn't work or work well or work the way I need, and people will find a new usage for it. And this can be applied to many different things. So I think obsolescence is something that is inherent in the life of any object, because an object, lives and dies at a certain moment. And so then the question is, can it be recontextualized so that its existence can continue and participate in that frugal society? But that means that there has to be a desire to use it on the other side. And sometimes that desire is not necessarily there at the given time, because some of us only want the latest model, the top model, with a certain position in society, a certain social status. So you don't want to use an old phone from 4 years ago because it's not the latest model. And if you look at all of these objects around us, well, there's many, many of them. There's a huge amount of waste because of that cultural desire and cultural practice. Well, what I see is that, I think technology facilitates many things. I said that the notion of time for the city and humans is changing. It's different. We have to look at what we mean by digital applications bring all to this. If we didn't have 8-bit, if you look at the computers of 30 years ago, we had to go through that step. Now we have incredibly powerful machines and that save lives and do wonderful things. And so it's a continual process. It's a continuity, building on what we have already built. It's a flow.
Deuxième donnée, c'est que cette génération dont je vous parle,
is that the younger generation lives in a real time, and in the cultural world they want instantaneous music. They want access. They want to, and it's obsolete very quickly. They've moved on to something else, and so they already live in a world of high speed flows. And so I think the ways of thinking, investing a lot of money over long periods of times and then benefit from them or get a return on investment, I think we need to move away from that line of thinking and move into a mode of acceleration of technology, because there are certain thresholds. At a certain time, there's the relation between performance and satisfaction, not performance and price, but performance and satisfaction. We can see, if you look at video games, for example, what we saw the 2 generations ago, that they had a good ratio for that. And we're seeing that that's declining, and we'll also see that in other technologies. It's coming. And so I think we shouldn't be asking ourselves the question about, the investments. Yes, you have to invest. It's a bit like, but it's a little bit like the steps in a staircase. You have to keep moving up the steps to have progress. So we are, in the field of robots. We hope to develop robots that can perform surgery. We hope to create robots that will replace cars. And we have to go through a certain number of steps to achieve that, because at the end of the day, introducing this, and this is where I think artists have a role to play to push us toward these new ideas. So thank you, everyone, for your contributions here and some interesting ideas. And Mr. Simons has brought with him some flyers about the project being presented. And so thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.